Here we go. I'm on again. All right, thank you for taking your seats. Again, we tried to build some networking time into this afternoon. I'm glad you're taking advantage of it. We encourage you to take more advantage of it during the reception tonight. Organize dinners. Please spend time together. It's an interesting group of people, and we want you to enjoy each other's company and get ideas and inspiration. Here's what we need to do this afternoon. We actually have a task we have to accomplish, and I don't get paid unless we get it done.
You don't get paid anyway, but there we go.
We want to come up with a series of tangible things that we can do in working groups tomorrow morning. And I'm going to tell you the end group. Here's the coming back from the moon. At the end of tomorrow, at the end of these working groups tomorrow, we need the working groups to have produced draft white papers. And those white papers have two things they have to do. They have to tell us why we need to get back together again, that we are sufficiently inspired and worth additional conversation. That white paper has to tell funders why they should pay us to get back together again. That's the outcome. Let me tell you how we're going to get there. I want to spend the first bit of our time together talking about the what. What is the thing that we are going to create? I've heard a lot of conversation today, but we want to all agree that we're headed down the same road, roughly the same speed. We're going to take another chunk of time to talk about the principles that we all agree will govern that what and our generation of that what. I've heard a lot of them today. Mary Beth had a bunch. I think almost every presentation has had, and often some of the same, but we want to have a list that we agree on is going to be the principles that guide us. When those two things are done, we're going to talk about the kinds of working groups that should come to bear in this conversation. I think we will come up with many, and we want to spell out what that universe of working groups would look like. Of those working groups, we're going to pick 4, and those 4 will work tomorrow. By the end of the day, we are going to have you signed up for a working group and have your charge going forward. So the what, the principles that will govern the what, the how, and you sign a piece of paper pledging to come back on a Saturday morning. Does that sound good? So Oliver, as our organizer, has the privilege to start us off on a what. And I'm going to say the what that you see above you is Oliver's proposed what.
And this is a proposed what that has come out in part of our discussions today. And the what is that we've at least got on the table is a protocol. It's not a things more than that. It's a protocol. And the protocol, at least as I'm thinking of, and there are folks here who have developed them in the room, and we'll get, I'm looking forward to a refinement of this, is that a minimum necessary domain of broadly shared ways of understanding and practice that will permit us to meet our goal. In other words, a protocol is something that allows us to have a shared way of doing something, and that shared way should be enough so that we can meet our goal. If our goal is mutual shopping, okay, then we have a grocery list, and we decide whether we want meat or milk or vegetables or whatever it is. It isn't that we have to then have the recipes themselves designed. We can cook whatever we want, but we have to have a way of shopping that would do that. Again, in the internet protocol lets Facebook happen. It wasn't Facebook itself. Okay, so we need to have things that will be, as I say, a minimum necessary domain of broadly shared ways of going about the world that will let us meet our goal, and our goal has some kind of collaborative aspect to it.
So how do people feel about that being the what?
You have no idea? You have no idea what it means? Okay. Well, there we go. I'll go sit down now. But no. What I'm attempting to capture by that statement is that a protocol involves some kind of shared way of doing things or talking about things that allows us to productively interact around getting to something. You and I don't. Yeah. Yeah, now, oh, good. Now the goals. I have a list of 4 goals that I will read to you because Rebecca wouldn't let me type them. And we can then, if we feel that this is an okay starting point, then really the next step is to go to some degree to what are some of these goals. And the goals will bleed into her principles, but they're not exactly the same. So first goal I had was interoperability and a capable communication between various systems of legal execution and specification. So at least one of the goals should be that we can have this kind of intercommunication and interoperability. Again, going back to Harry's example, I think it was, of the Android and the Apple phones. You know, they need to do, there needs to be something sitting between those that will mean that I can call an Apple phone as well as calling an Android. Okay? Second on my list was to better enable executable representation of contracts and many types of legal relationships. So first is the things have got to talk to each other a bit, and then they should also, if our goal is to create this kind of world of executable or computable law, contracts being the immediate target, then this, one of the goals for this set of shared things should be that it will help enable that. So things should be allow people to build on it to do that kind of executable stuff. Third on my list was it should also help enable the development of what we have called the stack, you know, of kind of the toolkit, if you like, which could include assembly tools, user-facing interfaces, input-output with workflow, with blockchain, so that there's the ability of this to work with other systems as well. And then the final on the list I'd put together was to enable products of value. Come back to this point, which is that, you know, things that don't have value won't happen. The protocol itself isn't necessarily the thing of immediate value. It's of a generalized value. It's of a nature of a public good rather than a direct private good. But it should enable folks who are clever and want to come along to build on top of it, to make Facebook happen, to make legal products happen, whatever it is. So there's an economic validation to the things it makes possible. So that was my list. I'd open it up to critiques, others.
I'd like a response. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I did understand the bottom four now. The part is that the minimum necessary domain. Now, what is that semantics of the domain?
Domain is perhaps, yes, Rebecca said, she put it in bold because she said that's a bad word, but she let me
I didn't
keep
say a bad word, I just didn't know what it meant.
In other words, a shared set of ways, whatever it is, that there is some grouping of these ways of understanding, etc., which will allow us to do what we're after. It doesn't have to be everything. Again, it's enough to make this happen and to happen reasonably easily, but it doesn't have to be more than that. It doesn't, yeah.
Okay. I'd like to go a little bit more specific on some of those topics. So what do you mean by executable representation of, let's say, of a contract? I think for me there are at least two possible interpretations. So essentially I implement a system that performs the activities specified in the contract. The other one essentially, well, I determine what are the legal positions determined by the contract. Do we want to do one or both or, well, something else?
I'm not sure that I would undertake that they're as separable as you're saying. In other words, if it does if it takes to this point, it has undertaken the legal legal pieces. Also, think backwards out of the legal system necessarily as it exists now to saying we could agree to the agreement is that we will run this program and we will accept what it does. Yeah, and then
Okay, so suppose that we have this example. Every Saturday night at 7 p.m., you have to bake a pizza. Okay, so that it will be a very small contract. Now, what will be the executable? The creation of pizza at 7 o'clock or reporting that there is an obligation at 7 o'clock to bake a pizza.
And both are possible examples of an executable contract. One is an executable contract with a workflow output that directly does it. Another would be an executable contract that sends a message, this is what should happen next. It could send a message to a human that says this is what should happen next, in which case then you do it. Or it could send a message to a machine that says this is what should happen next, and if the machine does it, you know, that's back in that kind of blockchain piece. Do we have, where's the other mic?
I have a comment from online. This is from Andrew Burt. It says, I'd benefit from an envisioned use case, a user story, for example, of what we're trying to provide. I'm really trying to get a sense of how granular this protocol seeks to be. So 2 questions there, he says, disguised as statements.
Ooh, what a good question. Again, the pizza baking contract could be that. In other words, could we have a piece of software that says that? I will go back actually to one I designed myself in a hard world, which was a limited liability company operating agreement, where I worked on a project to make that, where not only did it sort of keep track of its clauses, but it kept track of any decision made, it kept track of who owned things, it kept track of all of the pieces of its evolution and the decisions that it made and that kind of thing. So it was a contract that both knew what it was and then took care of portions of its own execution, of its own working its way through from input to conclusion. Again, that would be a possible example of something that would be a contract that executed. Harry, do you have sorry.
Okay, so is this just contracts? And we had talked earlier that maybe it wasn't just contracts. We were talking about compliance. We were talking about some other things and a more open universe, less of the closed universe of a contract. What's the goal there?
So representation beyond just contracts, but representation of all legal obligations or legal relationships.
There is a mild, slightly intellectually inconsistent dance that we're doing, which is that we're hoping to get principles that will have broader than contractual application, but we're hoping to use contracts as the use case to develop those as we go forward. So contracts as a whole are a use case. Within that are even more specified use case, specific use cases of particular kinds of contracts.
But we are looking broader than that.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Would it make sense to include as one of the goals the nature of the relationship between the chain code and the existing common law or statutory regime that governs it, or the paper contractual relationship that governs it? Because as I imagine this, I think that we'll start out with more if this then that chain code and a large portion of a contractual relationship being still governed by a paper agreement. And over time, that relationship will shift. But tying the contractual, the chain code into an existing paper contract or common law or statute.
I think that we could also say interoperability with existing forms of word-based law. Again, my own vision, and this is just my vision, is that we don't have to have that. We can have it be show us pictures. Again, this is a little bit like saying why sometimes I say why if we've got steam you don't automate the horse. You figure out how to work with it and go to the next. But you're right. At least in between, it certainly should work with it in a way that will be friendly to existing legal frameworks. By the way, at least my analysis is under U.S. law a fully code-based contract, fully chain code that we agreed was a contract would be fully enforceable under U.S. law in most states, just as we are now.
And do you contemplate writing into the code which law governs in like pseudocode or a comment?
If you and I agree, you can do that in the code, sure, absolutely. Or we could have a very thin piece of paper that says that code, everything in that is our agreement and it's under Vermont law.
Do you see any role for a jurisdiction to race ahead in the way that Delaware has in
absolutely.
corporate law?
I work with the Vermont legislature, and we've already got rules that explicitly...
You want to be the Delaware of smart contracts?
We're trying. Okay. But actually, the analysis that we did this summer at a session was that what is it? UETA, the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act, governs almost all of this, at least in anything you can call a transaction. And you're already, it's very broadly phrased. You're already there in almost any UETA jurisdiction.
Go ahead, Harry. Nope. Right here. Okay. Whichever one you guys want. Go ahead.
I wanted to go back to the question just a second ago about the user story and the framework, and I'm just trying to get my head around what the process is here. And Because, and I think we've got some product managers in the room who would maybe think about this a little bit differently too, but just thinking, let's define the goal, like where do we want to be, big picture, and that's long term, not tomorrow. Where are we now? Where are we now, right, in that process? Where do we want to be at the end of the day tomorrow? And then I could see empowering these user groups to experiment, discuss things, and try to think about how can they contribute to thinking, to getting us to the target condition, which by the end of the day tomorrow, to kind of move things forward. So it's like the framework for.
Someone framed it to me during one of the breaks as they asked me if we were doing a noun or a verb. They said, are we building a widget or are we going to the moon? Please tell me which it is. Is it a noun or a verb? Are you advocating for a verb or are you advocating for a noun?
I'm advocating for a process. And right now I hear a lot of people talking about goals, some people talking about solutions, and I think we've got a whiteboard in the front of the room.
Yep.
I mean, it's just an idea. It's just an idea.
We really do want to get to the process conversation, but I think there was so much confusion about whether we were going for a noun or a verb. We were trying to find that endpoint. So if we find that, I promise we'll build a road to it. But I'm curious for some of the folks in the room, are we talking, I think Oliver's talking about a noun. You have a thing you want us to develop, yes?
And a verb that will get us there. I mean, we have the paired task. I mean, the overarching hope that those of us who are doing this is that we will end up with the starting point of the iterative process of building something that will be that. And as we do that, we will iterate back and forth between theory, practice, that at least as we envision it, there is likely to be use case applications. Harry wants desperately for us to actually build some stuff, which is always a good idea. You know, there's a joke that's out there, which is that Harvard talks about it, MIT builds it, and Stanford turns it into a usable business proposition. You know, and we're going to go across all of those as we go forward. The trick to me is the, you know, how you make the cycle. We were talking a bit about this, the virtuous cycle of figuring some stuff out at the theory level, figuring out how we're going to process it and meet next, figuring out what it is we're actually talking about, you know, and build up until we get to something which I hope equals an adoptable a protocol which can move some of this forward and have enough involvement to go. The classic NIST is this my good segue to the NIST people. In a sense, this is a classic NIST kind of operation. Is that fair?
Can't speak about the organization, but
not speaking for the organization. Speaking as a person with experience in that organization.
Yeah. So actually, there are a couple of things, dimensions we can look at it. I was just talking to Mary Beth before this, is like if you want to, the idea is that we are all here and so many people are putting effort and time in there. So we really have to have some kind of an output on this thing. So like for example, for that executable representations, you want to kind of know what we are doing, where are we right now? And I'm just following up on the previous comment. Where do you want to be in 2020, okay? So now where are we right now? What are the gaps and how are you going to fill these gaps as such? And it'll be useful if you have a use case and you say, well, this use case is going to do with this current technology, with current things, this is what we can do right now. In 2020, we can do these kinds of things assuming that we fill all those gaps. So that's, and then of course there's a question of who's going to do what. That's a different issue on the thing. Because it needs to be asked, the Heilmeier questions are in DARPA, we ask the Heilmeier questions, however you look at, like why are we doing this right now? What are the benefits? Who's going to benefit? What are the benefits to society? What's the business model? Those kinds of questions will have to be addressed at some point. Thank you.
The Heilmeier Catechism. No, I'm not familiar with the Heilmeier Catechism.
Okay, well, I have to Google it. Heilmeier Catechism is a list of questions that comes out of DARPA. Heilmeier, whose first name I forget, was a director of DARPA in the 70s. And they're very basic but essential questions, and they tend to be really hard to answer. But they're a very good exercise to go through when you're proposing some sort of new initiative like this. So if you give me a few minutes, I'll look them up and I can read them to you.
We'll come back to you.
We'll put them up on the screen. Jeannie, let's pass this to Jeannie.
So going back to my initial question, and when we look back on interoperable systems and we talk about iterating, I want to make sure we're not just interoperable among technical systems, but within different areas of the law.
And that's a piece that we intend to keep on the table as we go forward.
And that means we're going to drill down into details, but then we're going to have to step back sometimes and double check across other systems that we are in fact still interoperable.
Yes.
Okay. Let's go here, 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 and then we'll go over to the virtual folks. So, 1, 2, 3.
I just had a quick follow-up on interoperability. There's two types of interoperability. There's technical interoperability, and there is trusted or accepted interoperability, where the systems are agreed to interoperate as opposed to technically capable of doing so. So it's the building of a cross-border jurisdictional system where that, in fact, it succeeds because it's allowed to be interoperable.
There's a children's story about this mice who had a great time having the run of the house, and until the owner bought a cat, and life became really tough for the mice. So the mice held a town hall, and the purpose of the town hall was how to deal with the cat. And they debated it, and finally one wise mouse jumped up and said, "I have it. Let's bell the cat. We put a bell around the cat's neck. When he moves, the bell will ring. The cat won't be able to sneak up on us, and we'll be fine." And they unanimously agreed to bell the cat. And then they asked for a volunteer. I raise this because if we're talking about all possible contracts, all obligations, we're setting a universe that is beyond boiling the ocean. If you go to the business world and you talk about smart contracts, they're going to be interested in knowing what is applicable to the businesses they run. And maybe we should be thinking not from the top down only, but we should be thinking from the bottom up in terms of what really is out there that could be susceptible to effective and beneficial use of smart contracts.
So I want to reflect just what I've heard in the room so far. I've actually heard both versions of NASA. I've heard, let's figure out where we want to be in 2020, figure out where we are now, and figure out the gaps. I've also heard, let's start from where we are and not try to over exceed our grasp and just work forward, just build an airplane. I just want to reflect that this room seems to be bouncing back and forth between those two, and I think one of the things Oliver's asking for is the 2020 vision, or the 2050 vision, or the 2000 vision. But I want to recognize that you're actually asking for the end point in this moment, aren't you?
Partly, but also we're getting the fact that you don't get to endpoints unless you iterate along a particular example.
But
that's also true.
When we ask what we're trying to aim for, I think we're still trying to find a definition, and I haven't heard one yet. There are a bunch of hands that have gone up. I'm going to borrow your mic for a second. Catch up with you, sorry.
So many things to say. So this is a classic strategy problem. Target state, current state, roadmap to achieve. We have to have all three. Target state, what we're talking about. Current state, we kind of see where we're at. The hard part is what is the next step. And what I'm hearing is it's some focused, limited use case, starting from where we are, that think we can get to in a reasonable period of time. Okay. Other thing I would add is that you want to make this you want to add international to the vision, cross-jurisdictional, because okay.
Yes, cross-jurisdictional is certainly our hope and have been in part of the design. One of the possible use cases would be the financial world. I mean, as we've heard, there's already work in this area. The relatively good area for decent payoffs are there. It could be a possibility. But you have here and then.
Yeah, just a quick point. I want to push back against this notion that we should pick something that is doable in finite time. I think the purpose of a vision here is not to identify something that we're going to get to, but to give us a direction to pursue in all those complicated conversations where we don't know where we're going to end up. Right? If we're not trying to engineer something where we know exactly precisely how it's going to come out. We just have to get the blueprints done. We should have a long-term moonshot vision. You know, when they picked the moonshot, it wasn't clear they were going to be able to do it. And we will implement and learn stuff along the way.
I'm seeing a whole bunch of hands. We're going to try to capture everybody. I think every hand in the room has been up, so we're going to see what we can do.
Okay. Is this
Yeah, it should be on. Go ahead.
working? Okay. Maybe I hope some lawyer in the room could comment on this, but I was wondering if there's if we could use our collective influence to prevent computational law from becoming encumbered by patents. I don't know where that fits into the protocol.
That's part of the open source. We'll put open source in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, 2 points. So Andrew Bird adds, I'd suggest we enable a centaur approach as well. If we can't allow room for human input, at least to begin with, we'll miss a big opportunity both from an efficiency perspective and from a buy-in perspective. He also reminds you, Professor Goodenough, not to forget Yale in your analogy. And finally, to a more recent point in regards to interoperable systems, Milos adds that I think we should also talk about interoperable across domains.
Would you ask Milos what he means by domains? Or Milos, I'm asking you what you mean by domains, if you will email that back in.
Sure, and I'll get back to you with that.
Great. We have one back there. I'm going to steal it again. I promise you get it back.
I would just be interested in how you would characterize the relationship between this effort and what's going on at Hyperledger, and whether there's any collaboration or way to sort of use the efforts that are already underway in other initiatives to make the goals of this and those initiatives achieved faster.
And the answer is, at least the organizing group of this has been hoping that we would be able to have outreach into other forms of this project. We have represented in this room, 25% of the relevant projects that are ongoing. I mean, your project has solved big chunks of this. We should hear more about it as we go forward. There are other places that are doing this. Again, we don't want to, part of the exercise of crumpling a thing up is that it may or may not be that any particular one of these is going to work. And indeed, if we've got 6 of them, in order to get them to talk to each other, we've either got to be really clever or people have got to give up some stuff. Hopefully we can be really clever. But we would invite into the iteration, if I am right that there's an iterative process, if we do this again in 4 or 5 months or whatever it is, what is it, we'd love to have more people in the room, more representation. That goes back to the points that the NIST people made.
So we have one, 2, 3. Yes.
So before I make my comment, I want to ask you a question just to make sure I make the proper comment. Is the goal of this session to come to a decision on what the overall goals are?
Yes.
Or is it actually to figure out, to decide collectively what the process is to come to the outcome you want tomorrow?
We have built into our schedule the time to work in smaller groups. One of the things that we feel is once we can identify some of the topics which are necessary, whether it's the processing logic, the data representation, the governance, there are a number of different topics that we can productively divide ourselves up a bit and work on those and then come back and talk to each other. The ultimate goal of this is the answer to 2 or 3 questions. Is it worth doing more of this and working on it? Are there people and resources that would be willing to commit into that effort? And then when and where do we meet again?
But maybe to answer that a little bit, I think we're looking more for that end goal and these working groups to help us start thinking about the long-term process. I hear the issue, I hear people saying, what's the process going to be? In some ways, we're looking to articulate that it is worth funding us to come up with a process. We're in a very early stage. Is that helpful?
So that's good. Okay, so I want to make sure I provide the right comment. So just from a product perspective, I know there are many other product leaders in the room too, that if I were looking at this from a product perspective, and there are 2 different angles you can attack this with, you can attack the West Coast style objectives and key results sort of approach, that if we have actually identified that these are the 3 goals, these would basically be the objectives that you've laid out for the group, and we come out with those 4 respective groups and identify measurable, actionable results that would achieve those goals you've identified by a certain time period. Furthermore, you would do a business case in which you'd identify what exactly is the background, what exactly is the objective for your specific area, what are the key results you'll do in a certain time period, what are dependencies, what are the risks involved. That would be the process that I would use if I were organizing a team of 50 people. But the other approach we could use, I'm opening this up because a lot of people know this. It's not just me that knows how to do this process. The other approach we could achieve is we could just go tomorrow and have a session where we go an Amazon-style approach. Of the goal is basically we would say by year 2017, you lay out in a 2 to 3 page document what would be the press release of what we have achieved by the year 2017. So I'm laying out 2 processes that I would use if I were running a business like this. And of course, just my humble opinion. But this would be a way to get actionable results out of the session tomorrow. And you probably already envisioned this, but I just wanted to make sure that was on the table.
That's really helpful. Thank you. The microphone's behind. Oh, or you take that one. Let me come right here. Still got you.
Okay. Well, following directly from what Jay said, I have a suggestion for how to collaborate and contribute tomorrow. So one thing is on the objectives part, it would be useful to select, not more than 3 defined scenarios with use cases of types of contracts. And the 3 that, I'll just put 3 out there that sound like any one or more of them would work for the people in the room to achieve what you're trying to get with a white paper and to be able to apply everyone's knowledge and creativity. And one of them is basically purchase. So you've got purchase of sales, probably at the supply chain level, or something at an entity. So you have the master contract and all the rest of it and precedent. The other one I think would be banking and finance, and specifically I'd say mortgage lending, so that it's possible to maybe zero in on the promissory note and then work it through a life cycle to when it's packaged into a security and think about that. You've already broken out some of that stuff. A lot of us have experience with those types of contracts, and we can nail down the parties, the transaction, the law, the performance, the success metrics. The third one I'd say would be what Ben Grossoff said, and it almost might be the best one because it's not so much baggage around it. And it's, we're doing some kind of web service, so I need an Amazon account, I'm going to do something on Rackspace. And I actually hacked on this a little bit for the ABA Analytics group with Thomson Reuters. We got a team together and just started strip mining like 5 or 10 of those contracts, and we did some automation and put them on a map and saw which ones are GDPR and whatever. It was a nice area and is defined. So I'd say I'd like to just actually get there and name some, agree, and then start to evaluate all the tools and all the processes and all the approaches and all the logic and ways people like we can actually push them against those cases, and then maybe begin to extrapolate something that's buildable and iterative. And then probably a different group in a different room for people that want to talk about the press release in 2027 and what the glorious end state is. But we could, I feel like we could get there iteratively if we start with scenarios and put the approaches to push against the scenarios and then begin to postulate things we could build or develop that would achieve the end state later. So that's my suggestion for how to part of how to organize.
That's helpful.
I'm beginning to keep track of possible use cases. I'm not on, or I'm just not close enough, I think. Oh. I wonder how it will sit on a bow tie. Is that better? Oh, I need
management.
Wardrobe.
As long as you're in wardrobe.
Wardrobe, thank you. A possible working group would be kind of use case definitions of figuring out what is it we're going to do, because it sounds like no matter what else we may do, we certainly want to have a limited set of fairly tangible, defined use cases to work against. And your other one that you were suggesting was the future vision. Is that a fair, okay? Other goals, thoughts? I don't mean to jump ahead into this.
You are, that's just fine.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. I want to make sure we've got 4 hands in the ground, and then we're going to do a little bit of a shift. So let's start here.
Okay. I have one remark, and it probably is self-understood and goes without saying, but I feel it has to be in the goals area, and that is like wide adoption, because I feel we are talking about the technical details, and I love it, but in the most important thing must be that whenever we're done, many people have to use it, so that user perspective and the adoption, whenever we have to make a decision tomorrow, we should keep in mind that we should make the best decision for that. I think it's built into a lot of what has been said previously, but I think it should somehow be there in explicit terms as well.
Right.
No, absolutely. If it's not widely adopted, we should all go and be talking someplace else. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so 2 points. One, I think as far as process overall for standardization is concerned, we could spend a lot of time and effort doing things that we can buy off the shelf, get off the shelf. We shouldn't build, we should buy, as far as standardization process, to be pithy about it. I have experience with founding and leading a standards design process, RuleML, which has worked with all the major umbrella standard setting organizations on the web, which include W3C, OASIS, and OMG. Those are the 3 most important ones. There's also ISO. ISO tends to come in late in the game to basically put its imprimatur on standards that were worked out in those other bodies in terms of substance. Okay. Now there's another model which sometimes works. You see it primarily in the financial area, which is a well-funded consortium of people come together. That's how XBRL was done. That's how a number of other standards for financial data interchange have been done. For example, using XML and things like that. But at our level of resource, our size of community, our maturity, our closeness to research, there is an obvious ordering here, okay? And I say that as someone who's been involved in, depending on how you count, 5 to 10 standards efforts, many of which were pretty successful, actually, all right? We are by far closest to the OASIS model of a standards organization. And it's probably not an accident that OASIS has been the main place where legal standardization so far for the web has been happening. And they are interested in it, they're friendly to it. A number of the people here have relationships to them. Guido is currently co-chairing Legal RuleML, which is done under the overall umbrella, sub-umbrella of Legal XML. Doesn't have to literally be focused on XML, I think, to appeal to OASIS. Second is OMG, because they're closest to the companies. So if it's insurance companies or whatever. I think the least likely of those 3 for this is W3C, although they're interested in financial. In the past, they've been a bit leery of something as far from hitting the ground in terms of lots of developers as legal has been. But that may have changed. I personally have very good relationships in W3, and so do some of the other people here. But I really think that on a lot of this process stuff, we can just cut the discussion and just go pick from the menu. What are our characteristics, and bring those characteristics to the decision criteria of which of the existing umbrella organizations to try to use the process of and do things through. And if you look at their process, you see, oh, you should come up with a proposal that covers this, that, and this other thing, but not these other 25 things, all right, which we can get very, very distracted and bogged down doing. So those groups, they have a process that takes you from scratch, making a proposal about doing a standardization effort. And that's not in opposition at all to recruiting various participants from the community, but it actually increases the credibility to appeal to them. So I really think we should try to do things.
That sounds like a
through an
great
umbrella.
transition to Mary Beth, because I think she wants to follow up on that.
Just a second very quick point. I do think that as far as what's specific to us, I really think the representation and reasoning capabilities around contracts, which is what makes them computable is at the heart. And so we should try to focus some of our activity tomorrow on that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
One of the things that I know NIST does, even though I don't work there anymore, is that they conduct, on occasion, strategic planning studies. And this typically follows when they are given a new mandate, either in law or executive order. So to give you an example of the title of those things, one is the economic analysis of an inadequate cybersecurity technical infrastructure, and that's a planning report. Another one is economic analysis of the technology infrastructure needs of the U.S. biopharmaceutical industry. And yet another one is an economic analysis, let me get that one, sorry, I missed it. The economic impact of inadequate infrastructure or inadequate interoperability for XYZ. And when these studies are done, and Ram, feel free to speak more authoritatively on what NIST does on this, but my understanding is when these studies are done, they bring in their staff experts from the laboratories, and they spend a good 6 to 9 months actually defining what they see the issues are. And then NIST will do an initial survey to refine the survey instrument, and then they use a cooperative agreement where they have an outside party actually go and execute the study and write the report. So I'm not advocating necessarily that NIST do this because the legal space is not really in their domain. Yeah, but we could maybe emulate what they do. So, and at another time I'll tell you about what the Heilmeyer questions are. I'll pass it on to somebody else right now.
Let's save time for that because I'm curious, but not quite yet.
Do we have?
Yeah, so this is the follow-up as to interoperable domains from Milos. What we usually call data within contracts are actually domains in their own right. For example, each party has to promise or provide something of value to the other side as part of contract requirements, and modeling of those values as domain might be relevant.
Okay, Milos, you're making me think, which is hard on my feet. So I will digest and we'll come back.
Yes, sir.
Just to follow up on what you were talking about, the standards approach is envisioning the types of things that might solve the fundamental issues of how to model contracts, to process them, to adopt them as universal exchangeable formats. But that is a fairly far-reaching visionary thing, which may or may not pan out depending upon what happens. I think it's an important topic. At the same time, it would be good to start with something that was more, say, a use case that was identifiable in which you could say, how would we progress down this path as well? So these two ends of the spectrum, I mean, something like financial services or contracts could be starting from now, how would we evolve it? And then the other side might be, how would we address the theoretical issues that might be intended for standardization in the future? The two different topics.
Together. Those would be good working groups for tomorrow. Is your suggestion? Oh, no. We have 2 more here. Was this a hand? And then here. And then we're going to make a little transition.
I'd like to elaborate a little bit on what Benjamin said. So, well, inside Oasis, in the past 4 to 5 years, we work on legal ULML. Legal ULML, it's meant to be a general standard for the representation of legal knowledge, the representation of norms, legal documents. Is a contract a legal document? I think so. So, again, I think that what we propose in legal ULML should be enough to represent contracts. And then, essentially, if we look at languages, tools for executing contracts, in the sense to determine what are the legal obligations, permission, etc., techniques and tools have been available for a long, long time. We can go back, probably in the first cases, we can look, for example, what was done by the Imperial College Group back in the 80s, 90s, with legislation as a logic program, and then back plenty of work at the beginning of 2000. The real problem of contract is, why do you want to have a contract with another party? Simply because you don't trust the other party, you want to have legal protections against the other party. So what are the issues if you want to deploy some executable contracts? So if I have a contract with another party, do we run the executable party on their computers or my computer? We need a trusted third party. And essentially, facilities, frameworks for trusted third party did not exist. Now there is a solution because blockchain provides a trusted party because the trust is built in a blockchain. You don't rely on a party in the blockchain. So essentially, what does it mean to deploy a smart contract, a legal contract, a computational contract on blockchain? So for me, the couple of issues will be, well, a possibility will be, can we use legal UML to represent computational contracts? And then the other problem will be, what does it take to be able to execute those contracts in a trusted platform?
And I hear that, and I think that concept has been echoed several times in the room. I'm going to, again, ask everybody to step one step back from that. I think you guys got that one already. There's a lot of really interesting work being done. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just also going to push back slightly. The trust issue is not unimportant, but actually the first reason you have a contract is to clearly specify your obligations. Most people enter into contracts expecting to execute them, and what they really want to do is have a clear roadmap of the thing they're supposed to do. And the trust issue enters in, but it enters in actually in a relatively small domain of contracts where you really think the other people are going to forge something, and then you need the blockchain or something like it like crazy. So anyway, it's not unimportant, but I just want to make the point that actually the clear specification of what we're supposed to do is what many contracting parties seek from a contract, rather than, and the enforceability is a secondary layer.
Right.
Could you scroll up to the goals section again?
Okay.
Because I'll pull it up for a second. So I think what should be added from what I heard is we need first of all, we need a standards approach. Don't know what it is, whatever, we need one. There needs to be a standards approach. We know we need standards somehow. Second thing is that we need a deployment model. Okay, it's what he was saying. Both smart contracts and mathematical theory say two parties can't trust each other. Okay, have to have a deployment model. So I think those two are key to what target state looks like. And then I agree with when then we need to go. This is this buy versus build thing. I think what we need to do is we want to make best use of all the work that's already been done, appropriate use of it. Okay?
And thank you. And by the way, thank you all so much for hanging in while we do this. I know that there's a modest amount of pain that goes with tromping through stuff. We had some ideas ourselves in advance. They're not exactly what's coming out. That's cool. Our hope was that we would have better intelligence collectively than we would have had individually. So again, thank you that as you work through this with us.
And looking at my watch, this was thank you, that was the perfect transition. This next half hour, we really want to make sure that we have gotten to all of these larger goals. And they've been generating somewhat organically, but we're missing some. What else? 1, 2.
Thank you. Thanks. Couple of things. One is just at a high level so that you're successful of what you're trying to do writ large. So there's an assumption here I want to push back on a little bit to make sure it's valid or so that you could abandon it. It's that you want to do a legal DSL, okay, that's big. And the thinking is, just to be explicit, let's start with contracts because it's a nice use case, and then in theory, we should be able to derive some more universal approaches for a general legal DSL. I want to just try on for size the possibility that that's completely false, and that contracts as private law and as agreements between parties and other things are so fundamentally different that the similarities are not sufficient to sustain a jump over to a generalizable domain-specific language. I think it's okay if it's not. That would be very good learning from this conference and figure out why is it different, how is it different, what do we do next? Should we solve contracts or should we flip over to statutes or whatever? But that's one thing I want to push back on, because as I've been running the scenarios in my head and thinking about DSLs I've known and loved before, I'm not certain that these can be compatible DNA. I mean, we shall find out. The other thing is there's a good idea that came from a legal hackers meeting last night that Tony Lai hosted, when we were talking about aspects of this. And it was the notion of business, let's say machine readable, human readable, like a plain language, lawyer readable, dense prose. And somebody, when we were talking about standards and the role of it, pointed out, you know, is there a criteria for doing almost like, let's call it like almost like an ISO 9000 kind of checking between conformance and accuracy between the machine version of a thing, a plain language thing, and a legalese thing. And it's come up in different narrow areas before, but that might be something we should elevate higher, because I think it's an essential aspect of what the world would be like in the future should there be a domain-specific language for contracts, at least as you would have the properties of having machine-readable, human, and lawyer-readable dimensions of it. How do we know when they're accurate? How do you measure that? How do you maintain conformance and interoperability and accuracy, confidence ratings? So those are my two contributions for you.
So kind of an error detection piece, which then also sits across these other goals of it being transparent both to ordinary people as well as to experts. No, I like that. As to your contract, is the contract enough? I'm willing to be disproved, but I have tried diagramming some of the logic pieces of regulation as well as some of the logic pieces of contract, and at least so far I have not tripped over stuff that was not there in both. Now you get into court representation of court findings, you get a little harder, but that's in the sense because the court findings are Dionysian. They are the classic American way of doing that is more of a data extraction IA than it is a rule-based approach. Anyway, at least my preliminary work led me to think that contracts could be used as a working task for most of what you would run into certainly in regulatory and legislative enactment. But I could be proven wrong, and I've put down there the representation capacities and processes of contracts. Is it representative of the law generally? I think is a good question.
So I have a couple of comments and questions. So I guess to your earlier point, Jay. So if we're trying to scale basically the use cases through a protocol, and if the closest thing we have today, as acknowledged by the group to a smart contract, are financial contracts, and they're not acknowledged as fully executable smart contracts, should we be prototyping what that end state needs to look like with one use case first before we start scaling it? And then, personally, I have never been through a standard setting process, but from a process perspective, should we be having someone that has been through the process of building the standards, sort of guiding us through that process end to end, so that we're not going all over the place? So, I mean, I'm just curious as to what we should be focusing on tomorrow, if we are going to be focusing on the use cases and getting that use case in prototype form from end to end in order to be able to abstract sort of what we think are the scalable components of it. Should we be looking at use cases that are likely interrelated somehow?
And for whatever it's worth, I've been trying to keep a running track building out of what we're doing, and I've got 6 possible working topics. I won't necessarily say groups yet. And the ones I've gotten so far are use case definition. What are our use case pieces that we're going to do? What a future vision piece that would be the 2020 things that are going. What exists and could be used, and that is both has the subcategory of things and of processes. Benjamin, your expertise is here in part for that. When we have examples of some of these various processes in the room. In fact, we have the NIST deck. Would it be useful to go through that at some point here, or is that too distracting? Okay, we have a deck of NIST. If it was NIST, what we would do? Maybe not. All right. But the point being is that we could break out and have some of the people coalesce around that and report back to us. I think our goal is to have people break out around the topics we think we would really like to try and know more about and make some decisions about by the end of our gathering tomorrow, and have those people come back and report, and then be the basis of going forward. The way we had framed it up was tell us why should anybody support us and what do we want to do. But those were just focusing questions. Keeping going forward on that though, process models, that to some degree goes back to the process approach, and development and adoption strategies as another possible topic for us to coalesce around and think.
And I've got 2, maybe 3 hands that are up right now, but I'm going to remind folks that I still want to hear a few more goals because we're going to shut that down in a minute. So yes, sir.
So yeah, I wanted to build on what you just said, and what you were not able to answer. How do we even know, or do we know at this point, how law could be formalized? And you answered basically by, yeah, we looked at contracts, regulations also look quite good, and it's immediately obvious those are very concrete elements of law, right? And law gets more abstract the further down we go towards the Constitution. And it's very likely that the criticism that we heard, or the idea that we heard, that maybe the tools must be completely different than the DSL that we start out with. The point I want to make is that maybe standardization is completely not what we want to do here, and looking at ISO and the different standards bodies is completely not going to be helpful, but instead it would be wonderful to even have the first working prototype, or have a research idea, a path towards how could that even look. I mean, we're like on the opposite end almost of that spectrum, where in the end, when you have 20 competing ways to do things, you want to standardize them to make them more powerful, but we don't even have one for certain things, right? So, and I think that's not going against the idea of being here together and CodeX, but maybe standardization is a little early.
So I've got one over here, and then I'll come back. Do you have your hand up? I can't tell. Do you have
I don't
your
know
hand up? I can't tell.
where this would fit in, but I really like the idea of articulating a protocol. I think it's kind of a meta point, but to know what to build, it's sometimes helpful to think about at a high level what that should look like and how that can be abstracted away. I think that there's, particularly in the smart contract space, there's been a lot of work done with use cases, and I'm happy to point people to some work done in that vein. But I think at the protocol level, and thinking about the different layers and what those could be really helpful, because then it makes it easier to actually start building things. Because it's like, writing an outline before you write a long article or paper or something along those lines.
Well, thank you. That is at least in part my intuition, which is that we have a lot of stuff, and what we need is a little more coordination possibility, and but the coordination and the doing have to come together.
Yeah, but maybe that could be a working group of sorts, just people who may be interested in thinking about that at that level.
Elements of a protocol.
Right.
Yes, sir.
So I'll just try to attack it from a startup sort of mentality. If we were given $500K, I think a number we'd mentioned, $1 million, if that's our goal, and we need to do this, then what is the best use of this great group of people's time to get us that funding? And if I look at the things on the board, if I were to think about this from a startup mentality, well, we got to get a use case, a working prototype, so I completely agree with the sentiments from the back here. We have to have a working prototype, if this were, we were building a product, we would also be building the platform. And the platform, the analogy here is kind of the fact that we have the standards, the process. What are the tools? So they have to work hand in hand. The prototype has to work with the platform in which you build it. And then I don't know if we need to go deployment adoption. I don't know if we need to go, that's a go-to-market discussion of, you know, do you want to talk about go-to-market this early in the game? If we want to talk about future vision, I think that's useful because that's, we're pitching, we're creating a deck for that $1 million funding that we need to get, which is real. This is not unreal. We need to get the funding for this. And so I see those three as kind of the key sort of elements. Now, the thing that's a blind spot for me, and there are other people who are much more knowledgeable in the room, is what does it take to create a standard, a process, a protocol? And that is the part I don't know too much about. But I'd say those three elements seem very logical as things that we need to focus on to get that $500K or $1 million in funding to continue the work that we're doing here and move it forward.
So just to
And
summarize something, sorry.
Pass your microphone just to the right to finish up, to answer that question, but go ahead.
So to just...
No, Mary Beth.
Oh, you want
Yeah,
me to
go ahead.
answer the question?
Yeah, well,
What do
you're
we
there.
need to do to standardize or to come up with a standard? In my experience, it's you plan to plan first.
You do what first?
Plan to plan. You plan to plan.
Plan to plan.
And that there obviously are a lot, I mean, the reason we're here, there's so many efforts going on. And the plan to plan is to make sense of those efforts and to identify the gaps and the challenges, both technological and standards, to look at what exists, to look at what's going on in practice, and then to identify what that future vision is, which this is all in there. But the typical approach is current state. You look at current practice, you look at current technology, you look at current standards. Then you look at sort of this intermediate state, what's in the pipeline, so more immediate in terms of what you anticipate nearer term practice to be, what you anticipate is coming out of research, what you anticipate is coming out of standards. And then you identify what's missing and what the future state should be and the gaps and the challenges in technology, in research, and in standards. Now, there are lots of ways to do that. What I see emerging here is a framework. And that framework, we've got we've got one part of it, which is the use case. What we don't have right now, which was mentioned earlier, terminology.
So you don't have what?
Terminology.
Terminology.
Vocabulary. That's going to be a big effort. And we can start, that can be a working group. Another thing is, okay, taxonomy. What are the elements? So that was mentioned, but elements of what? Earlier we had talked about a reference model as opposed to a stack. Well, we can talk about elements in this taxonomy which identifies that reference model or even perhaps a reference architecture. And the architecture or model helps establish the relationship. Then you have another part that talks about standards. Let's start collecting what standards already exist. You can talk about security and trust issues, privacy. Those can be yet additional parts, and each part would have a working group to focus on this. But then it all needs to be centrally coordinated too. And then you can go on to topics that are specific to this domain. And by domain, I mean legal interoperability.
So,
okay.
just a quick. I just want to make a quick point on Mary Beth, I think that's absolutely accurate. I think if we were, what I'm seeing here is several work streams, and the question is, are they sequential or dependent, right? So first, the framework of, let's assume we use Harry's framework and say, okay, we're going to prototype using this framework because we're making the assumption that it's a scalable framework, right? And you have certain work streams working on prototyping end-to-end smart contracts on for certain use cases. And what I'm not, obviously you need to set the taxonomies, the framework, everything in place so everyone is building under that sort of structure. And then assuming we get to that end-to-end, you're able to abstract sort of the common elements, and you're able to come to that idea of a protocol that could exist there. And in that case, my question is, should we even be, should we be looking at standardization processes in parallel to that, or do we wait until we have certainty that there is a standard there?
Good question. On timing, again, my own intuition is that there's a bit of a workies up piece of this where we do them all simultaneously, but that obviously is a complex idea rather than a simple one in a sense. Yeah.
Jeanette.
I was going to suggest proof of concept is an alternative to prototype, which has the sort of flash in the pan feel to it, and proof of concept where we're taking and looking at a bunch of use cases and really trying to formalize it in some way that fills in the holes, right? And then I wanted to read the Heilmeyer Catechism. What are you trying to do? And thanks to Susan, by the way, for looking this up and posting the link. What are you trying to do? How is it done today? And what are the limits of the current practice? What is new in your approach? And why do you think it will be successful? Who cares? So going back to that marketing question, if you build it, will they come, is what I always tell my students. And this isn't the field of dreams. So let's build something useful. What are the risks? How much will it cost? How long will it take? And what are the medium-term and long-term goals? So not just that end of game, but let's have some milestones along the way.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I just made a note of just trying to distill some of these different overlapping areas that have a center of overlap but might be distinct. One might be a research-oriented, solving the theoretical problems, how to realize domain knowledge and practice in an extensible evergreen architecture, sort of a top-down approach. Second, a more specific use case that allows prototyping, proof of concept, and exploring solutions, e.g. financial contracts. Maybe that's a bottom-up idea. And third, challenges to adoption, governance, business value proposition, requirements, and objectives. So what are the bigger issues surrounding the research? So those seem like three topics that overlap in the center at some point that might be useful.
Kind of a Venn diagram that comes together. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
So, first of all, you're all right. You don't have standards without working examples that you've tested. There's no such thing, or it's not a very good idea. However, it's good to have a target and have an approach and recognize you want to get to standards. So in TM Forum for years, we have kind of taken a stab at a standard based on experience, and then we built proof concepts to extend the standard. Since we don't, so one of the things is look at the existing standards. If there's some we ought to build on, let's agree on those, okay, or test them with one of these use cases, and then we're going to learn and figure out where things are at. In the meantime, I do think it's really good in parallel to have that, okay, how are we going to grow this in parallel? Vocabulary and that kind of thing is absolutely foundational. When we look at things in TM Forum, that's always the first thing we do is let's agree on what we're talking about, let's agree on the concepts. And I think we got good foundations there.
Actually, can you hand it backwards? We have some folks online.
Thank you. I would love to see a maybe even short session where we try to articulate our intuitions in very pure form, like including maybe what we hope for because we would love to go there, if that turned out to be possible at all. Like taking it from a very passionate side, maybe even, and go by and admit that what we hope for, it might look where we finally might get.
Yeah, we have another question from Milos. Should systems and processes used for migration or transition of all contracts in current form into new form of computational contracts also be in scope?
Good question. So transition, the question from Milos in London is, what would be a transition pattern? I'll put that here as well. That relates back, a couple of you have talked also about, you've talked about the mixed aspect of portions being automatable and others not. Again, a transition piece is a good thing to do. I apologize, my handwriting is declining. Transition, there we go. My students try not to throw things at me when I go at the blackboard and start to scroll. Anyway.
I've got a good one from Sandy Pentland. Thank goodness I've got a contract folder. I just was rummaging through it to see what's important. And so a challenge that he posed when we were getting ready for the Kauffman Foundation thing, when we thought we were going to call that computational law conference at one time. And I asked him, what matters? Who should we invite? What are the big challenges? He said, on the contract side, something that's missing that's always bugged him and that he thinks could be engineered better is for whatever system you come up with, whatever application or level of a stack you attack, really get people focused from the start on the success metrics, how you would measure performance, outcomes, basically the yardstick, and like what would be the objective data that you would use, what criteria would you apply, how would you know if we've achieved the thing that we said was important when we use these tools. So he just really heavily emphasized elevating that as part of the dialogue. And so I want to sort of channel him and pass it forward now that we're talking about it again.
Right.
Sandy Pentland.
As I look at this list, I'm looking at things that came up this morning that we haven't put on this list, and I just want to raise them and see if they belong here. I don't see the word security yet. Is it there? It's on Oliver's list. Okay, I want to make sure that we got security. One that Oliver often brings up is generativity, if these systems are self-generative.
True, and generativity is that goal that is that possible term for we can create things we don't envision now. When the internet protocol was made, nobody envisioned, and I'm sorry to keep picking on Facebook, but they're just down the road. There we are. Nobody envisioned Facebook. It could happen. So you want, again, it's the don't be Minitel question.
Does that apply?
Yeah. Architectural consideration.
Right. But at least it's there. The other one I just want to reflect is I don't see transparency. Does that matter?
Open source and transparency are two different things.
No, that's why I asked. Does that belong there? Okay.
As a practical matter, contracts frequently embody law and regulation that isn't specified because it applies to the contract. So as a theoretical matter, if you want to have a universal paradigm for smart contracts, is a predicate for that having smart regulation and smart legislation so that those legal and regulatory things that bear on a contract get incorporated as well, if it's going to be truly self-executing?
That's a great question.
That's a long-range goal. Again, my thought on this was that if we had the protocol would make something like that possible if it had Jeannie's more universal aspect to it. If Daz is right and it isn't, then there we are. But we can once we get this done, then people can go out and use things like this to create it. Actually, the legal the rule ML and the legal XML have had pieces of that, and there's been portions of that adopted. Is it the African countries? There's a couple of African countries that have done that.
So there are two components. One is a commentoso, and the other is there are two components. One is Acomantoso or legal doc-ML, and the other is legal rule-ML. So legal doc-ML, it's about the structure of documents, not the logical structure. So essentially, what is the sections, what is the subsections, what is the et cetera, what are amendments, and how to apply amendments to the documents. Legal rule-ML looks at the logical structure, so essentially how to represent legislation, legal documents, norms, in a rule-based format, and then essentially to determine what are the obligations in place, what are the obligations in force, given a particular situation. And again, as I told you, plenty of tools already exist, and if somebody's interested, I can give a demo. Just come to me.
Yeah, I just want to mention what's involved in transparency beyond openness. How many of you understand what's going on in the Linux kernel? Nothing more? Great, that's great. There are a few people who do, but most people don't. Okay, so effective transparency involves explanation, involves terminology, at least in this area of contracts. And also, a lot of it is just about being able to shorten and simplify and standardize it all so that people are familiar. So there are a lot of kind of soft edges to the notion of transparency, and openness is only one part of what it takes to achieve it. And this is a huge issue right now in AI overall with machine learning.
Great, thanks. Jeanette? I'm going to throw some sort of out there questions at this from design thinking, and I'm going to throw 4 design thinking questions at it. What problem are we trying to solve? Who is our ideal user? And I've been thinking about who would use this an awful lot. Is it the lawyers? Is it the programmers? Is it hardware at an endpoint? Is this an Internet of Things question? And then what do they want to do? What goals are they accomplishing with our tool and our standard that we're creating? And then what do we want them to try to accomplish? And I don't know that we've answered all of those questions well. Yes, sir.
So one of the things I think is missing that's really important is an off-ramp outside the legal domain. This gets back to the how do I connect this to the real world? Because if I don't have that, this is a limited value. And my reaction to your question about design thinking is I would be building some business model canvases about the specific areas we're looking at to answer those questions.
Our last goal here was to put together working groups for tomorrow morning, and am I not on? Am I now on? I'm on. To put together working groups for tomorrow morning. Oliver has helped distill everything that we've been having, every conversation we've been having. Here's where we ended up. We put these to you for reactions. These are not set in stone, but we thought that this was the best distillation of what we had talked about so far. One group to talk about that press release. I'm about to ask you for your first lines. I don't know if anybody wrote one. But kind of what is that long articulated vision? What does it look like in 2070? The second group to talk about structure. What are the pieces that we need? What are the elements? Is it a stack? Is it not a stack? What exists? What needs be invented? What can we borrow from other systems? What maybe needs to be cooked up from scratch? A third group to look at the best use case or use cases, to examine what exists and figure out what's the best way to do a proof of concept here. And then finally, a fourth group to really talk about the best process to get us from where we are today, through both, keeping in mind both the vision version, the structural version, and the use case version. How did I do, Oliver?
Yep. Sounds good to me.
All right, reactions.
Could there be a fifth group that builds things where we could do rapid prototyping, test some stuff, discover from doing?
So tomorrow morning we have 4 rooms.
And that to some degree is meant to be the use case
So
group to talk about. The prototyping piece would be building. Yes. So that would be, if you want to talk about building, I'd go to use case.
There you go. Build it while they talk about it.
You're at MIT, that's what you do. We used to be at Harvard, I'll talk about it, you'll build it.
And the aliens will want.
And the Stanford folks will figure out how we make money. It's all right, it's a deal.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that to come up with there's a dialectic coming up with the vision, and the two building blocks typically are, what's doable technologically and pieces such as other standards to build on, and use cases, and the value, what good it does it do in the world. I think that has to be part of the use case discussion. And so you might want to split out long-term vision from use case, which has to have a lot of those same questions that you listed under number 1 belong in use case also.
That's a nice division, thank you.
So under number 3, we should put in the use case. Part of why you're selecting is use cases should have value as well as being easily amenable. By the way, I will point out that tomorrow's day structure presupposes that we let folks percolate around whatever the topics are for the morning, but that then we all get together at lunchtime and give an interim report. There's also the possibility of shifting back and forth. About halfway through the morning, one of us will come in with a little card saying, you may now shift groups if you wish, so that people who are will have a polite moment when they can go someplace else if they want to.
If their group is a little dull.
And then finally, so at lunch, we'll have some exchange around this. We'll give some reports. People can go, yeah, but and then we'll have another hour or two to sketch out a kind of a where we are now, and then a final debrief, and that's the end of the work for this time.
Great. I want to keep talking about these briefly, but thank you.
At the risk of being Captain Obvious, use case needs to consider the audience, the users, who's going to use it, how they're going to use it. And does the idea have merit in those situations?
That's my shorthand for now. Other thoughts, comments about orientation? Yes, sir. We lost you. There you go.
I have a 2060 line.
Okay.
Based on the last 3 years of data, it appears that law school admissions have stabilized at 10% of the 2017 levels. Now that 90% of legal work has been automated, AI did indeed kill the lawyers, starting with electronic forms by the late 2040s, and that's now been recognized over the last decade by first the bar associations and then the legislatures in each of the 52 states.
Does anybody think they can beat that? Oh, yeah. All right, go. Oops, sorry.
By 2040, we note that law school admission has picked up because it's become an alternative engineering profession. Okay? And in that engineering profession, they're building tools that can be used for legal purposes, and they're engaged in coding and implementing law.
As a professor, I like the idea that we still have jobs. Yes, sir.
Hot off the presses. Stanford Law School officially changed its name to CodeX, the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics.
That one's, I think, is winning right now. You got another?
Okay. And the 2060 Nobel Prize in Economics goes to?
This
us.
group.
Yay!
On that note, I think we have a sense of what our groups are. I think we have a sense of what the future might look like. I kind of like the Nobel Prize for my grandkids. We will be passing around, Susan in just a moment, is going to pass around sign-up sheets that is at least a start. And we hope that you will distribute yourself out among these 4 groups in the morning, again, knowing that you can exit gracefully if you decide that the group you're in is maybe not where you need to spend the whole day. So are those going around, Susan? Okay, great. So those are going to be coming around for the next couple of minutes. I will remind you again, and we will put this in front of you, but there's so many things to do, and if MIT wants to build us something tomorrow, that's great, but here is the actual charge for tomorrow, which is, again, we want folks to come out with some, I'm using the term white paper very broadly, but we want to know why this is interesting enough to talk about again. I don't think we're going to solve it all tomorrow, so we want to have a chance to meet again and why someone should pay us money to get on planes and come together and think in these ways. So this is the actual product that we're going to ask you to do. I know you're going to do much more big thinking, but this is the thing we're going to drive you to tomorrow.
And speaking of a target for getting on a plane for next, we do have the kind offer of CodeX to host a next, presuming that we get to the end of tomorrow and we say we should do that. We have a kind offer from them to gather here again, probably early in the coming year, as at least a reasonable target. Also, the notion is that the working groups, in addition to working tomorrow, presumably have some ongoing life in between and can be a place where they will come back with a much more fleshed out set of recommendations. We hopefully move to a stage where we can then have some kind of recommendation piece, although we may, if we follow Benjamin's, there may be a different template that we end up with after an iteration or two as well. I have elicited some suggestions from folks on the East Coast. Columbia and Cardozo in New York have both said that they might be possible locations. Again, scattering ourselves a little more geographically isn't such a bad idea. There are a couple people in a couple of institutions in London who have been making noises about things, so we can indeed go across the pond at least most of the way, if not quite all the way. Italy is a center for this. We have German folks. We have the European Commission and European Central Bank. We have places to go. We have Singapore as a place for this. So again, we will figure out places to go. But at least in the immediate term, we have at least a couple here in the U.S. we can go if we do the next iteration. Yeah.
Is there some kind of knowledge forum or collaboration community that we could have where we all share our work together?
Excellent, good point. Susan, there is the current piece is just the website for this conference, but we should move from that, transition from that, and indeed that's something we should give some thought to perhaps tomorrow in the plane, and we'll give a little thought as to what Stanford can host and can't continue to host. For the time being, if there are pieces of your work or work that you are aware of that would be useful for the community, we can continue to post on the website for this meeting. And I would encourage people to do that. When you do that, I would encourage you to send things in the 2 to 5 page range as opposed to into the 500 page range. So you know, I mean, not to say that there isn't expertise we can share, but if there's are digestible units of work that you think would be useful to share, that would be a good idea.
All right, my last 2 minutes of assignment is I'm supposed to sum up the day. This is it, and then we go off into the evening. But I want to do this summary briefly, and I want you to tell me if I got the highlights right, because I think it's good for us to leave agreeing what happened. I think we came with a nice welcome. We had a bunch of folks set the table for us. Oliver gave us vision. Mark gave us warnings. We heard about standards. Susan talked to us about process. That was the first bit. Harry actually gave us at least one use case or at least one conversation where we could start. Then we had lunch and had great speakers at lunch talking about different ways this could happen. We came back together and had Meng tell us that we aren't the first people to ever think of this idea, imagine, and talk about what's actually going on now. And then we spent the afternoon in a fairly, I think, robust, raucous conversation talking about how to even struggle with these events and these ideas, coming up finally with groups. That's a silly, easy little summary, but did I miss anything really important that happened today?
We had a couple of nice presentations from CodeX.
Yes, thank you. Lunch presentations from CodeX.
Nobody killed anybody.
No,
we got to know each other.
Not that we know of. Offline, you know.
It strikes me that it was, I mean, this was one of those meetings, it was hard to get you to sit back down. So I think there was good networking that also occurred.
Now, Susan is going to, if we're set, there are some logistics involved in this. Let me set this up. There she is.
So I'm going to say thank you very much for being with us today. Here's Susan, who again is the person who organized everything, and I want to thank her again for her work.